Do 4 out of 5 dentists really recommend Colgate? Is this a marketing gimmick or a real study? What does the 5th dentist know that we don't? All of this and more on today's episode of The Secret Life of Numbers.
Welcome to the Secret Life of Numbers podcast, the podcast where we dissect everyday numbers and statistics to find the stories behind them.
Each episode, we take a number or statistic and break it down. We will tell you where it came from and what it means for you. Along the way, hopefully we will inspire you to think about the numbers in your own life.
I'm Levannia, your data scientist on call. I'll be breaking down the numbers.
I'm Lindsay, your data translator. For when Levannia gets too technical on us, I'll be breaking down the rest.
Okay.
So we have a very exciting episode for you today because it is the first episode in what is going to be a 3-part mini-series.
Yes, it's very exciting.
So riding the high of our financial mini-series, we have a mini-series all about oral hygiene and the numbers of dentistry and dental care.
Some of the things we'll be talking about, like today's episode, do 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate? We'll also talk about flossing and toothbrushing.
Exactly. Today we're talking about toothpaste, but more specifically, we're talking about the claim that was made by, honestly, what seems like every toothpaste company, which is that 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate or whatever other brand. We started to wonder, where does this number even come from? It's so ubiquitous. Is this a marketing gimmick? Is it a real study? And why does that one dentist not recommend Colgate?
It is curious, right? Like, what do they know that we don't about Colgate toothpaste?
The dark underbelly. But before we get started, we just want to have a quick word from our sponsor, Colgate. Just kidding. We don't have sponsorships. If anyone would like to sponsor us, you can email us at secretlifeofnumbers@gmail.com. But other than that, let's dive in. So, Levannia, I think you have the information about where this comes from.
I do. And it's really quite a convoluted story because this ad began circulating in the 2000s, and it wasn't in the form that we currently know it. So it wasn't 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate. It was actually 80% of dentists recommend Colgate toothpaste. And then around the same time, there was also another ad circulating that's the classic 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident gum or Trident sugarless gum. And the two kind of merged together in our minds, I suppose, into this 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate. Because 4 out of 5 is 80%.
I think it's interesting that the form that I feel like we all remember it in wasn't the original form and was actually conflated with the gum ad.
And it's funny because I don't remember the gum ad, but I remember the Colgate ad.
Well, I think part of it's funny too because this was a long time ago. It's the early 2000s.
That's at least 15 years that we've been hearing about 4 out of 5 dentists recommending Colgate.
Okay, so I have a question. Did Colgate actually do any research to support the claim? Where did it come from?
I mean, they did something, but we'll discuss whether or not we would label it as research.
Oh, they did something.
So let me break it down. Colgate hired a research agency to survey dentists and hygienists about toothpaste. But the survey that this research agency conducted did not explicitly ask whether or not dentists and hygienists would recommend Colgate over other brands. They just asked what toothpaste brands dentists recommend. And if Colgate was mentioned, they counted it as a recommendation and marked it as the sole recommendation of the dentist, even if they recommended Colgate and Sensodyne at the same time.
Oh, so they just waited for them to rattle off all the toothpaste brands that are have fluoride in them and are okay.
So, I mean, I wasn't there. but it sounds like that could have happened.
They're like, okay, one more. Do you recommend any others?
Does it start with a C? Does it rhyme with fate?
Oh, man.
To add on to that, the survey was carried out over the phone, and the script used during the survey did not make it clear that the research was being conducted on behalf of Colgate or that the results could and would be used in a mass marketing campaign. And actually, the guise used by this research company carrying out the survey was that they were an independent market research company that were conducting a survey to assess hygienists and dentists' attitudes towards dental products.
There's so many issues with the way that this was done.
I mean, there's a lot to unpack here. You're right.
And also, I think it's a little shady too, because providing a professional recommendation as a dental professional for something that can be used for marketing, like there's ethics revolving around that, and there's advertising laws around that. Like you aren't really supposed to be doing that, and it's just not fair that they didn't give them a chance to know that that's what it was. At least based on what we've mentioned, that like we weren't there.
Yes.
I doubt there was an ethics application for the study.
There's a lot to unpack here about how the study was conducted and what they could have done wrong or what they perhaps didn't do 100% right while they were collecting this data. But one thing I've chosen to focus on for this episode is sampling and where or how we can make claims on data based on how we collect it. And actually, I think this is something that we'll be talking about in each episode in the mini-series and kind of building on this idea as we go.
Yeah.
So when I say sampling, Lindsay, in this case, what do you think the goal is of sampling?
Okay, so one of the goals with sampling is you want to get a sample that's representative of whatever population or parameter that you're trying to measure or study, right? So you want your sample to be unbiased. You want it to be ideally random.
That's perfect.
I think a lot of it comes back to like the fact that your study's really only as good as your sample.
That's more than I could have asked for.
Oh, thank you.
Because really, the goal of sampling in this case is you want a sample that, as you said, is an accurate representation of the population that is making the claims, because that's the way you can guarantee that those claims apply to the rest of the people that you haven't sampled. Like a funny example of bad sampling would be like asking like soccer players if they thought, like professional soccer players, if they thought playing basketball was hard. And like if they thought, like all of them will probably find basketball difficult to some degree, or it won't be an accurate representation of whether or not basketball is easy or not to play. So you can't apply that data to the question.
So what are some of the different types of sampling methods?
You kind of mentioned the word random, and I'm so happy you brought it up because sampling falls under two umbrellas, random and non-random. Non-random, as the name suggests, is when you pick the individuals in your sample not at random. So, for example, volunteers who agree to participate in your study. There's something called snowball sampling, where one case identifies others of this kind. For example, if people have a certain condition in a family.
Right. Or like vulnerable populations too. Snowball sampling is often how things are done, right? Because if you know one person, they might know other people within that group.
Exactly.
So on and so forth.
Yeah, there's other types like convenience samples. You just sample those that are convenient to you. So if you have an online survey and you post it and a certain amount of people respond, like that's a convenient sample because you didn't actively seek them out. And there's other things like referred samples as well, or referred cases, quota sampling, where you just sample up to a fixed number in a group. But all of this is non-random.
Right. I guess there are cases where we're not necessarily looking for like a random sample, right? Like, for example, with a lot of qualitative studies, you might be looking to like understand the experience of a group or something like that. So then you don't want a random sample because you might not get the people in the group you're trying to study.
Well, that's the thing about non-random sampling. If you collect a non-random sample, the findings that you come to at the end apply to your non-random sample, but you can't be certain whether or not they apply outside of that non-random sample. They can give you clues about what might be happening outside of that sample, but you can't be sure.
Right. So what about random sampling methods?
I'm so glad you asked, Lindsay. There are many different methods of random sampling, just like there are many different methods of non-random. But let's begin with simple random sampling.
Sounds like a good place to start.
Yeah. It doesn't sound like sexy or adventurous, but it's where we start. So simple random sampling, you can just think of that as every individual in the population has an equal chance of being selected for your study.
Mm-hmm. So I guess the population that you're pulling from would include everyone?
So every potential person that you want to sample would be like on a list, and then you would randomly select from that list. So say you had a list of students in a high school that you wanted to survey, but you couldn't get all of them. So you randomly selected based on the list of their names.
Oh, okay.
Systematic sampling is an extension of the simple sampling. So if we went back to that example with the high school students and you have a list of all the students, you could just take a systematic sample of every like fifth person on that list and ask them the survey.
So that one's kind of ordered. So it's not as random. Would that be correct?
I mean, I guess, yeah. So it is ordered in a sense. Like, so say you had patients coming to a clinic and you said that you would sample every fifth patient that came. If you think about the days across which you would sample, you would probably only be sampling at certain times. So you have put some non-randomness into your random sampling.
Mm-hmm. But I guess it's possibly a way of kind of controlling the amount of data that you gather.
Unless you have someone who's like always coming in at the same time every day, that might not necessarily be a concern.
I guess it depends on the clinic.
Yeah. Then you have multi-stage sampling. Or so this is if there are 2 or more stages in your sample. So say you needed to sample some sort of test across hospitals in different states or in different provinces. So you could choose the province as a stage, you could choose the city as a stage, and then sample within the cities.
Oh, so there's randomness at multiple times. Like you randomly choose a province, and then you randomly choose a city within the province, and then you randomly choose the hospital or the patients within the healthcare authority. Okay, interesting.
The thing about multi-stage sampling is because we've randomly selected across many stages, we really only like to resort to this type of sampling when you can't do the simple random sampling.
Right.
Then there's stratified sampling. This is my personal favorite type of sampling, the type that I do a lot in my own work. So this is if you have a population of men and women, many different ages. You want your sample to have the same ratio of men to women as in the population. So say they were 60% men, 40% women in the population. In your sample, you would want your sample to reflect that stratification. And then say there was like 10% younger than 18, you would also want that same stratification to appear in your sample.
So you group them by whatever kind of demographic you're looking at, and then you sample to the percentage you need for your total study.
So you group them by like the bins that you are looking at, and then you would sample based on those bins.
Makes sense.
Finally, the type of sampling I want to talk about is cluster sampling. So in some surveys or studies that are carried out on large populations across large geographical locations, it can be difficult to get the number of subjects that you need by simple random sampling. And it can also be really costly as well.
Right.
So what happens in these cases is you can identify clusters, for example, like households, or for example, like dentist's office, and sample everybody in the cluster to obtain the amount that you need. So you randomly select the clusters.
And then you take everyone in the cluster.
And then you take everybody in the cluster. One thing to note is that cluster sampling can produce misleading results if what you're sampling is clustered itself, right?
Right. And depending on where you're going, like if it's a place of really high incidence of something and you're like, oh, wow.
Yeah. Like, for example, if you're sampling occurrence of measles and you do cluster sampling in a measles hotspot, your sample will not be representative of the population.
Yeah. If there's a region where the vaccination rate is really low and you sample just that region, you might be like, oh, my goodness.
Exactly. There are other types of sampling, but I think we've covered a pretty exhaustive list.
I feel like we've done like a SparkNotes version.
Yes. We've done a SparkNotes version for you. Some other types are like lot quality assurance sampling, but we won't get into those.
Yes, we'll leave something to the imagination.
Yeah. I mean, we'll leave you some room to grow. So, Lindsay, now that we've kind of talked about all these types of sampling methods, what type do you think this research company was trying to do in their study?
Well, it was definitely not random. Mind you, maybe it was random, though, because maybe they were like, oh, we're just going to look at dentists and hygienists and just phone everyone and see who picks up.
Maybe we don't have enough information to know what type they were attempting to do. But which type do you think would be most appropriate?
Honestly, this is hard because I feel like, so you'd only want to sample dentists and hygienists, but you can do that either randomly or non-randomly.
Well, I mean, the fact that they say dentists recommend and then they ask dental hygienists is a little misleading.
Yeah, I found that part kind of misleading too. It's one thing if you frame it like dental providers or dental professionals or something. Mm-hmm. But like what they did in their claims just don't match up. And then the way that they even just asked the questions, let alone how they got to the people to ask the questions too, is frightening.
There's a lot to unpack. But I think at least when we went through these types of sampling, I think I might have gone with either stratified or maybe clustering. Stratify based on like if we're only looking at dentists, stratify based on age, based on sex, based on city that you're sampling.
Like to see if there's differences in recommendations across different demographics?
Yeah. Or like maybe if we're thinking about toothbrushing, like maybe, I don't know, across the country, is there differences because of water? I don't know if that could be something that influences it. So that's why I thought maybe stratified, or if that was too expensive, like cluster sampling as well, like randomly pick dental practices and sample everybody there.
That could almost get into like multi-stage. Randomly select the cities, randomly select like dentists from within those cities, and kind of drill down if you can't sample everyone.
Yeah.
I think the main point, though, is that this, you can't see my air quotes, but it's not really a study. This research gone wrong is exactly that. Like it's bad science, it's bad research. And I think there's a lot of a manipulation with this too. Like there's no explanation in the 30-second advert or like however long it was about where it even came from. It's just thrown out there and they hope you buy the toothpaste.
Like there's no statement of, I suppose, repeatability or bias as well. Like if you are a dentist and you yourself use Colgate, are you more likely to recommend Colgate?
Probably.
Yeah.
It's not a reproducible study, right? Like part of the reason we have a rigorous peer review process and we publish in peer-reviewed journals, or that's the goal, is to have that transparency of this is what we did. And if someone else followed these methods, which we have written in sufficient detail for someone to actually follow,
like, this is how we sampled. This is why we sampled this way.
They should, if it was done well, or if they measured right things, it should be reproducible. You should be able to get those same results. And if you're not, there might be something else going on. And then that's kind of a point to look into it more.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we've talked about where this number even comes from and a bit about methods of sampling, let's talk about some of the regulations that surround advertising and also why companies might be incentivized to bend the rules a little bit. All of this after the break.
Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we talked about where we get the statistic of 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate. And we talked a little bit about sampling, but now let's talk about kind of what happened after that advertisement ran.
What I find really interesting is when I first started looking into this, I had just assumed that since we had all heard a different variation of the statistic for various companies, that Colgate had no repercussions for a misleading advertisement. But this is actually not true. So ads and marketing campaigns are regulated.
Okay.
So this particular advertisement from Colgate was aired in the United Kingdom. And in the UK, we have the ASA, which is the Advertising Standards Authority. And it's an independent regulatory body for advertising in the United Kingdom. Their job is to apply the advertising codes that are written by the Committees of Advertising Practice, also known as CAP or CAP.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically the ASA monitors ads for anything that violates the advertising codes. And then they also field complaints from consumers and businesses about ads. And this is a direct quote from their website, they take action to ban ads which are misleading, harmful, offensive, or irresponsible.
So did anyone complain about 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate?
A lot of people complained, and Colgate got into some hot water with the ASA over this advertisement. They received numerous complaints about the claim that in the original advertisement was 80% of dentists recommend Colgate, because it implies that dentists recommend Colgate exclusively over other brands. And it also gave the impression that this was a professional endorsement by dentists.
For Colgate toothpaste.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we get into some he said, she said between Colgate and the ASA.
Okay.
And what Colgate's argument was that they claimed that this statistic applied to their whole brand of Colgate and not the product that was featured in the advertisement that says that 4 out of 5 dentists recommend it. And if anyone's curious about what toothpaste it was Colgate Total Advanced Fresh.
Ah, that's a very minty one. I've tried it. So I guess the big boo-boo here was that Colgate was saying that 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Colgate overall, all of their toothpaste, all of their products, but the brand that ran in the advertisement was the specific toothpaste.
That's part of it. Basically, the ASA concluded that written permission for professional endorsement of Colgate by the people that were interviewed, those dentists and hygienists, wasn't obtained. So they didn't realize that what they were giving when they answered this phone call about what's your attitude towards dental products, that this was going to be used as a professional endorsement.
Okay.
And there's rules about professional endorsement. So basically, there's a CAP code or CAP code that health professionals can't endorse medicinal products.
This seems like they are.
So basically, overall, this was over 10 years ago. So the numbers for the different clauses of the CAP code that they violated are all different now. But I can kind of run through the ones that were listed in the articles that I read. In total, Colgate breached 4 different clauses with this advertisement. So one of them was about substantiation. One of them was about truthfulness. Another was about testimonials. And then the final one was endorsement of medicines. And under the code, it says directly in there, and this is a quote, professional endorsement of licensed medicines in advertising is forbidden by CAP code and the law. So I think it's safe to say that Colgate got a slap on the wrist with this one. What they did was misleading, and I think they were rightfully held accountable to it.
But it's funny, though, because while I know about 4 out of 5 dentists recommending Colgate, I don't know that this was the result. That phrase is still quite ubiquitous.
One of the things that I find interesting is the fact that this advertisement was originally aired in the UK. We're in Canada. I feel like we've all heard it. We've talked a bit about the laws in the UK, but Canada also does have laws for advertising.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a little harder to find information on than in the UK. But basically in Canada, we have the Competition Act, and it's kind of the main federal statute that we have that prohibits misleading or false advertising. And it's enforced by the Competition Bureau, and then they decide whether to pursue civil or criminal avenues to enforce the act if necessary.
So we've talked a little bit about the repercussions that Colgate faced for this advertisement. But what I want to know is why they would even make such a claim to begin with. Given these laws, why would they make such a claim?
I think one of the reasons is kind of exactly what we've been talking about, is we all still remember it, right? Part of the reason is it's very effective marketing.
Yes, that's true.
You know, when I was reflecting on what we wanted to talk about during this episode, I was thinking it'd be really interesting to talk about why it's effective, what is used in marketing. I looked into a little bit about cognitive biases in marketing, and I am not an expert by any means in this area. So we'll just do kind of a brief overview of one that I think really applies in this scenario. We can have kind of a debate about whether that's the case. And the cognitive bias that I think might be at play is something called the authority bias, which is that we tend to consider a claim to be more accurate if it's given by an authority figure. That gives us a tendency to be more influenced to believe the claim, or believe that their opinion about whatever it is they're selling or whatever the claim is true.
So in this case, because it's 4 out of 5 dentists are the authority figure, and we'll take the recommendation of our dentist in regards to our oral health.
I mean, my dentist recommends Colgate.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds reasonable too.
Like, you're willing to take what your dentist says. Like, I'm no expert in toothpaste. I'm willing to take whatever they say is going to be the best one.
I mean, I'm thinking about my own toothpaste, and it was in fact recommended to me by my dentist many years ago, and I've never looked back.
You use Sensodyne, right?
I do use Sensodyne, yes.
Yeah. So my mom is actually a dentist, which is part of what makes this episode so fun. It's interesting, and she's in the 4 out of 5, but she also recommends Sensodyne and
probably many other dental products as well.
Yeah, exactly. And part of what she says is, at a certain point, you know, with fluoridated toothpaste, it's about taste. It's about what are you going to use.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just given the definition of authority bias, I think it applies to this claim. Like, why else would they specify dentists, for example?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that they omitted dental hygienists.
Yes.
Even though they purposefully went out and sought their opinion on this.
Yeah, like they didn't say dental professionals. They said dentists.
Maybe they thought it would be more, I don't know, more like convincing. I think
maybe.
I think it's very strange.
If I were to ask myself a question like, whose recommendation would I take for toothpaste? The first person that pops into my head is my dentist, which is maybe why they considered them the authority and the one to put in the claim.
So one of the things that I encountered, however, after I learned about the authority bias, which may or may not be at play here, is the research on authority bias. It's not all about dentists. It's scattered across lots of different disciplines, and there's a lot of different examples of it that aren't necessarily in advertising.
Okay.
One of the ones that I found is, it's all about like cognitive errors in medicine. And it's kind of the authority bias in a healthcare setting, which used the example of giving steroids after spinal cord injury, which for a while, based on what I've read, it was convention. And then new guidelines came out that recommended against using steroids. But because in the hospitals, people had already gotten so used to always using them and it was convention, there was hesitancy to switch over. Like, are they going to think I'm a bad practitioner because this is the way things have always been done, even though the guidelines were updated?
So even though the guidelines have changed, because the authority once said it, that bias exists.
Yeah, it was a really interesting study because it was, am I going to be liable if something happens? But then one of the examples that they pulled on to talk about authority bias is they brought up the classic example of Stanley Milgram's experiment on obedience, which was conducted at Yale in the 1960s. And this is a pretty well-known one, but for anyone who maybe this doesn't ring a bell for, basically he had two people, and one person was the actual experiment subject, and they were the ones told to administer shocks to someone else who was in on the experiment and not actually getting shocked, who was the learner. And it was supposed to be about, they wanted to basically see what maximum shock someone would give someone else when ordered to administer a shock under the guise that it was a learning experiment.
Oh, that's interesting.
The person that we're actually studying, and they would be in this room and they'd have this switchboard in front of them with all the different voltages. And I think it went from 15 to 450 volts.
Okay, that's a lot.
And they would be instructed by the administrator to ask a question to the learner who was in a different room and they couldn't see them, who would answer. They had a certain ratio for how many they would answer right and how many they would answer wrong. And then for every wrong answer, the administrator would tell the person to administer a shock. And they wanted to see how high they would go. And at 300 volts, the actor, essentially, who was not actually getting the shots, but was under the guise of getting the shocks, would start kicking and stop responding to questions, presumably because they've been injured by the shock. And Stanley Milgram thought that people would stop there. The hypothesis was that, at that point they would stop the experiment. They had a whole protocol for how they escalate the demand to administer a shock. And it got more and more direct. But then I think I'd have to double check, but after a few times of asking them to do it repeatedly, they would back off. But in total, out of the 40 men that they tested, 26 of them stopped at the maximum of 450 volts.
Because the authority figure encouraged them to keep going.
Exactly. And when I think of this example of authority bias, the 4 out of 5 dentists really seems a little more insignificant.
But I guess it could shed some light onto why a claim like that might stay with us and also encourage us to purchase Colgate.
Yeah. I think so. I guess maybe it's authority bias on a micro scale. If there's any marketing gurus or psychology experts out there listening who would like to shed some light for us on what cognitive biases they think might be at play in this advertisement, you can email us at secretlifeofnumbers@gmail.com or send us a message on our Instagram @thesecretlifeofnumbers. So, Levannia, do you know what time it is?
I do.
It's time for our science seed.
My favorite part of the episode.
Me too. Each episode, we like to give our listeners something to think about. A science nugget to help you think more critically about the numbers and statistics you hear every day. And today's seed is all about, drumroll.
It's about sampling. What we'd like to leave you, the listeners, with is that when you hear these claims, it's important to think about how that data was collected. So is the raw data an accurate sample that can be applied to the population that they're making that claim about? And then how was it collected as well?
And I think it really comes back to the fact that study is only as good as the sample and the data behind it.
Exactly.
Data manipulation starts at the sample.
It does. That's where it starts.
So we need to be careful about how we're sampling if we're conducting research, but we also need to be critical of how researchers have done their sampling in order to appraise their conclusions.
And then I guess it's also important to note that it's nearly impossible to have a 100% accurate sample, but you have to make an effort to eliminate bias at every stage where possible.
And you know what? We have techniques developed to eliminate bias. We have methods that are more rigorous, and so following those is ideal.
Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you find your podcasts. You can find the references we used for this episode in our show notes. A special thank you to Julian Bertino, who does our sound editing and music.
Have an idea for what number we should cover next? Or do you want to learn more about things we've talked about in this episode? Follow us on Instagram at The Secret Life of Numbers.
We'll catch you next time on The Secret Life of Numbers, where the numbers can run,
but they can't hide.